Eyewitness testimony is a tricky thing. On one hand, psychologists and other experts insist that eyewitness testimony is not a guaranteed thing, that the human mind is perceptible to being influenced. By what exactly depends on the person and position they find themselves in at that moment. On the other, without eyewitness testimony, what else do we have, really? When we hear about many people seeing or hearing the same thing, we tend to believe them. Many police cases can be guided or even driven entirely by the support of witnesses. As a species, we tend to believe when multiple people claim to have seen the same thing. However, what happens when a large group of people claim to have seen something we consider to be outrageous? Something too ridiculous for our minds to comprehend? What happens when an entire town sees something that nobody else has ever seen? Do we believe them? Are they victims of mass hysteria, simply buying into whatever their neighbor was selling? Or is there something more mysterious afoot? Something paranormal or otherworldly? What happens when these sightings correlate with large-scale tragedy? This is the story of Point Pleasant. Point Pleasant is a small town located alongside the Ohio River in the western portion of West Virginia, near the state's border with Ohio. Nestled at the confluence of the Ohio and Kanawha rivers, Point Pleasant is located approximately 110 miles southeast of Columbus and approximately 150 miles east of Cincinnati. Originally established as a military fort in 1774, Point Pleasant gained notoriety for the battle that took place where the town now stands. At the time, the area was unsettled by Europeans, having been home to a Shawnee village for several decades. However, throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, colonial expansion into Ohio country began, and conflicts arose between these settlers and the indigenous people that had already been living there for centuries. Today, many consider the Battle of Point Pleasant in 1774 to be the first battle in the Revolutionary War, but it is still technically listed as a major tipping point in Lord Dunmore's War, a conflict that had arisen between the Scottish governor of Virginia, John Murray, the 4th Earl of Dunmore, and the Shawnee and Mingo American Indian nations. The leader of the indigenous army, who went by the name of Chief Cornstalk, was later betrayed and killed by Virginians under the guise of peace talks, and was buried in what is now Point Pleasant. Many would consider the later events of Point Pleasant to be part of Chief Cornstalk's curse upon the region, but there's no proof that he actually held any ill will towards the citizens of the area. In fact, it seems like the curse of Chief Cornstalk as it's known was little more than a rumor that sprung up in the area following a 1921 play set in the town itself. Regardless, this urban legend still clings to parts of the Point Pleasant saga to this day. Woodrow Derenberger was a 50-year-old salesman who traveled throughout the region selling sewing machines. In the latter half of 1966, Woodrow, Woody he was called by his loved ones, lived in Mineral Wells, West Virginia with his wife and 2 children, approximately 55 miles northeast of Point Pleasant. Described as a sober man who regularly attended church, not much stood out about Woody. That is, until the evening of November 2nd, 1966. That Wednesday, Woody was driving home from Marietta, Ohio along Interstate 77, a route he had driven numerous times before. At approximately 7:25 p.m., as he approached the Route 47 interchange just south of Parkersburg, Woody was almost stopped by the bright lights of a car-like vehicle which quickly approached him from behind. Described as a dark, long object which traveled approximately the same speed as his truck, Woody claimed that this vehicle hovered 8 to 10 inches off of the ground. Woody claimed that this mysterious craft passed him on the road before it cut in front of my vehicle and continued to travel at some distance sideways. The vehicle was later described by Woody Derenberger as being charcoal gray in color and apparently made of some kind of metal and shaped something like an old kerosene lamp globe, having a flat bottom and a dome-like top. On closer inspection, Woody described the vehicle as not having any visible lights, but emitting a fluttering soft noise as it moved, giving it an odd otherworldly vibe. He described it as being long enough in size to cover both southbound lanes and berms, forcing Woody to pull his truck over to the right side of the road in order to avoid hitting it. There, with his foot on the brake, Woody kept his own lights on, shining bright ahead on the dark craft stretched out across the road. After coming to a complete stop, Woody claimed that a man stepped out from the side of the craft, which opened up almost like a dropship door. This man began approaching his vehicle, telling him to roll down his window. As he described later on, this man spoke through thought waves or mental telepathy, and was able to speak to Woodrow without opening his lips, keeping his face affixed with a permanent smile for the next several minutes. Woody described this man as looking pretty normal for the time, standing about 6 feet tall, appearing to be between 35 and 40 years old, with dark hair that was slicked back and a pronounced widow's peak, resulting in a sharp V-shape at his hairline, in addition to a dark complexion. He seemed to be wearing a topcoat, trousers, and a shirt buttoned at the neck, as far as Woody could tell, and kept his arms folded and his hands under his armpits throughout the entirety of their conversation. Despite looking normal, Woody claimed that this man's clothing was blue and quite shiny, having a glistening effect, which only added to the otherworldly vibe of this strange encounter. Through his open window, Woodrow held a 5 to 10 minute conversation with the strange grinning man, who introduced himself as Cold, claiming that he was a searcher from a strange foreign land. As recounted by Woody later on, the man told him, "Have no fear, we come from a country that is not nearly as powerful as yours. We mean you no harm." Cold asked what the lights were in the distance, to which Woodrow replied, "Parkersburg," as in the nearest town. Cold claimed that his people had similar places in their country, which he referred to as gatherings. After speaking to each other for just a few minutes, Cold cut the conversation short but promised Woody that, "We will see you again. If you wish to inform local authorities, it is all right to do so." At the conclusion of this strange encounter, the saucer, as described by Woodrow in later interviews, dropped down to the ground, having been hovering between 50 and 75 feet above the road throughout the conversation. Once down on the ground, the same door that Cold had exited out of opened yet again, and he climbed back inside, with another occupant within reaching out an arm and physically helping him. Then, as described by Woodrow, the door closed, sounding much like a car door. Then the craft took off in a burst of tremendous speed into the night sky, never to be seen again. That evening, Woodrow Derenberger hurried home, telling reporters, "I started my truck and drove like hell." After returning home, Woody's wife noticed that he was visibly agitated and asked him what was wrong. He told her what he had experienced just minutes prior, and she encouraged him to call the police, as he had intended after getting back on the road. At approximately 9 p.m., Woody called his local authorities, with the police later describing him as very nervous when describing the encounter he had had with a strange being that he called Cold. One day later, Thursday, November 3rd, 1966, Woodrow Derenberger was called in to give a press conference at the WTAP TV station in Parkersburg, West Virginia, during which he told his side of the story from the night before and answered questions from reporters. When asked whether or not he had believed in any paranormal or extraterrestrial stories beforehand, Woody stated, "I thought they were all nutty." During this press conference, Woody described Cold's ability to speak through telepathy as very upsetting, and when asked whether or not he thought or hoped that Cold would contact him again, stated, I believe they will, but I hope they won't. Also in attendance were state and regional police officers, as well as a representative of the U.S. Air Force, who said that he was going to pass along Derenberger's account to his higher-ups in either Washington, D.C., or the UFO Investigative Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. At least a handful of the police officers in attendance told reporters that it was clear that Woodrow Derenberger had some sort of experience, and believed he was telling the truth about certain aspects of his account. When asked whether or not he'd be willing to put his credibility on the line and take a lie detector test to prove he was telling the truth, Woodrow Derenberger agreed without missing a beat. That same day, Woody gave an interview to the same news station, WTAP, from his home. There, he told his story to a pair of reporters.
Now, Mr. Derenberger, for the sake of our television audience here, the words that you used, cold would be like cold is his name. This is how it sounded to you, that his name was cold.
Yes.
And the word gathering was like we would know together or something like this.
Yes, that's what he meant. That was the impression that he gave.
And he did not move his lips nor utter any sound whatsoever. He talked with you in telepathy then.
That was right. That his lips did not move. He uttered no words at all.
But you talked. I mean, he didn't.
Yes, I talked. He told me twice that I could either talk or I could think, which either would be better or easier for me.
This was an instant thing. There was no hesitation on his part nor on your part. You knew immediately what he was communicating to you, and he knew immediately what you were communicating to him.
That is right.
But about the texture of his skin, the color of his skin, his eyes, eyebrows, eyelashes, hairline, what were these, what did he look like?
He looked perfectly natural and normal as any human being. He had, his face looked like he had a good tan, a deep suntan. He was not too dark, but it was just like he had been out in the sun a lot and had a good tan. His hair was combed straight back, and it was a dark brown. And he seemed to have a good thick head of hair, and his eyebrows, his face, his features were very normal. I don't believe that he looked any different from any other man that we'd meet on the street.
Now, this ship that he stepped out of, when he left the ship and started toward your truck, toward your van, the ship remained there as he walked toward you? Or?
No, immediately that he stepped out of the truck, or out of his vehicle, the door closed and the vehicle lifted straight up. It went straight, just as straight as you could point upward. And it went up, and I did see it. And occasionally as I was talking to this man, I looked up and it was still there. It was approximately 50 to 75 feet off of the ground, and it stayed there all the time this man was talking to me.
Now, when he talked to you, did he turn his head away as I'm turning my head away now, or did he stare right at you, or did what was his movement?
He watched me when he was talking to me. He looked at me directly in the face, but as there were several cars and several big trucks passed, and as these big trucks would pass, he would turn his head and glance at the trucks.
But there was no... did you look at the object in the air while he was talking with you? Did you glance up at
Yes, in fact, I leaned forward and looked kind of out of my windshield, and I could see it. It was still...
So then this communication that he had with you would not necessarily depend upon him looking you in the eye or anything like that, then, evidently.
No, he did not. In fact, when he first got out of the vehicle, when he told me to roll the window down, it was impossible for him to see my eyes because I was behind my own headlights, and he could not have done it.
How old would you say he was?
He looked to be approximately 35, 40 years old. He was a very nice-looking man. He was neat. And
what specifically did he say to you? What did he say? Hi, it's a nice evening, or what? I mean, why did he stop you? What was his?
When he asked me to roll the window down, which I did, I rolled the window down, and he told me, he said, I would like to talk to you. And I just couldn't answer him. I just couldn't speak. And at that is the first time he told me not to be frightened. He said he wished me no harm, and he talked a little bit in this vein, and he asked me why. He said, "Why are you frightened of us?" He said, "We are the same as you." He said, "We eat, we breathe, we sleep, we bleed, even as you do." He said, "We are like you." And he said, "Please be not frightened."
Did he say where he was from?
He did not say where he was from, but when he asked me what Parkersburg was, and I told him, he said at where I stay or where I live, my home, he said, "We call this a gathering."
Did he say anything about him? Did he volunteer? Did he have a family? Did he ask you what you did for a living? Where you were?
No, he asked me. He asked me if I worked for a living. He asked me if I had to work to live, and I explained to him what I was. He even asked me where I lived, and I told him. And I told him that I was a salesman, and he told me that he was a searcher.
A searcher.
A searcher.
But he didn't tell you what he was searching for.
No, he didn't. He didn't offer me no information other than this, but at 2 or 3 times he did tell me. He said, "Mr. Derenberger, look at me." He said, "Do not be frightened, look at me." And I believe if I hadn't have been frightened, I believe that if I had have looked to him, I believe that I could have understood a lot more of what he wanted me to than what I actually did.
You just have this feeling, you mean? But
I have that feeling. I was very nervous. I was very upset after this happened. And after I got home and after I had calmed down, I can look back now and I see where I should have asked him questions, and I believe I had the impression that he would have answered these questions readily.
you believe in flying saucers?
I have never believed in flying saucers before. I have heard about them a few times. I've even read in the paper about flying objects, but I honestly never did believe in it.
Do you believe in them now?
I believe in what I seen last night. I don't believe it was a saucer, but I believe it was an alien, some kind of an aircraft or spacecraft or something.
Now, you said that he also made the statement that we will see you again.
When he was getting ready to leave, he stepped back from the truck about 1 step, and he said, "Mr. Derenberger, we will see you again." He didn't say I, he said we will see you again. And when he got in the truck, or when he got in the vehicle, the door opened as he walked up to the vehicle, and he stepped up into it, and there was another man, or I couldn't describe this man because I could just see his outline, but I did see his arm and hand reach outside and take a hold of the door and pull the door closed. And when the door closed, it made an audible noise like you'd shut a door on a big, heavy automobile.
What kind of a noise did this object make when it was hovering above the ground 6 or 10 inches, and then upon letting the man off, and you say it went back up in the air 75 or 100 feet. This is an object now that we're talking about that's 8 or 9 feet high, 36 feet long,
yes,
and about 8 or 9 feet across.
That's right.
In breadth. It would, although it's really not too large an object, it's larger than what an automobile, for example.
Yes.
And to lift something like that would take a lot of force to do this. What kind of a sound did this make?
The sound when it was hovering over the ground and when it was lifting, I couldn't distinguish no difference in the sound. It was a low, fluttering noise. Well, if you've ever heard the blades of a helicopter as it was idling, setting on the ground, that would be the closest way that I could describe the noise it made. But it was not very, very loud.
Can you make a noise that it sounded like? Or are you...
It was a fluttering noise. It sounded something like...
But it's a sound you have never heard before.
I had never heard anything like it before in my life.
Let's get back to this let's get back to the fella here now. He was how tall?
I would say he was close to 6 feet tall, and he'd weigh around 180 or 185.
I'm 6 feet tall. He's heavier than I am.
He was about your height.
But heavier than what
yes,
I am.
he was heavier. His face was more full.
How much do you figure that I would weigh?
I'd say about 165 to 70. 170.
You're right on the button. That's right. There were no lights. This was dark. This time of night it was dark.
It was completely dark, but I never at any time turned my headlights off, and I also had the lights in the truck on. I have a cab light, and then I have lights back through my truck. Mm-hmm. And these lights were on. It gave good illumination up close to the truck, but not too far back. But while he was standing and talking to me, I could see him clearly. And at several times there was cars passed and trucks passed, and especially cars that came up from behind me. As they came around this bend, they were throwing their headlights directly on the back end of my truck and was throwing a good light on him.
But no one slowed down or
no one
paused
slowed down.
Like but they would have easily been able to see him.
Yes, they
could. Do you
could
suppose
have
maybe somebody in our audience might have passed you last evening? Well, standing there talking with this fellow.
I know that there was several cars past me, and one car, as this thing settled down in front of me, was coming to meet me. And when this thing was directly in front of me, this car came to meet me. And his headlights it was in a kind of a curve. This guy came to meet me, would be making a left-hand curve, and his lights would be shining off to the right. But I still think that he could have seen and probably did see whatever this object was.
The time when he left you, when your conversation was ended, how did you know that it was all over? Did he say, did he say anything to the effect that, I've got to be going now, I have to go, I know, how did he terminate this conversation?
He terminated his conversation very quickly. 1 second we were talking there, and the next thing this vehicle settled down right beside. He stepped back from the truck, and when he stepped back, this thing came right back down. Now, it wasn't crosswise the road when it came down. It was heading in the same direction I was. It was right the length of the truck. And when it settled down, he turned and walked up around in front of my headlights and back. But just before he started, he said, Mr. Derenberger, we will be seeing you again.
You believe he will?
Well, I did believe it, but now I don't know how to answer that honestly, because I'm afraid he will, and I don't want him to. But I have a feeling that he will.
You're apprehensive that he will see you, yet
again.
Yet you would probably like the experience again.
Well, I don't
you be
think
more prepared this time?
I don't think that I'd be quite so frightened. I think that I could ask him a few questions. I think I could ask him just about as many as he's asked me now.
Well, Mr. Derenberger, we're because of time, we appreciate you taking the time to come down here with us.
While it's easy to write off a lot of Woodrow Derenberger's claims as little more than fiction, perhaps a hallucination of some sort, it's important to remember that at the time, UFOs hadn't quite fully entered the region's zeitgeist. Even if he hadn't experienced what he claimed to, I find it highly unusual that a 50-year-old sewing machine salesman would make claims like these without any prompting. Woody had no previous accounts of making outlandish statements, and wouldn't really from this day forward. By most metrics, he was in the middle of living the American dream, and seemingly threw that all away by reporting what he had seen, or claimed to see, that one night in the fall of 1966. One by one, the people that Woody had come to trust chose to stop believing in his allegations until he essentially stood alone. The one person that never wavered from his belief was Woodrow Derenberger himself, whose life was thrown into chaos after he reported his sightings to the police and the press. His claims brought his reputation, his name, and even his sanity into question, attracting a lot of attention that Woody and his loved ones hadn't expected or desired at any point in their lives. Woody and his family were harassed by UFO enthusiasts who wanted to get a glimpse of the spaceman named Cold. These individuals would camp outside of their home, hoping to get a peek of the grinning man, and would pepper Woody and his loved ones with phone calls at all hours of the day and night. Because of this attention, which focused on the supposed ridiculousness of his claims, Woody's friends and family members began to shun him. Each time they encountered a personal loss or tragedy, even one as minuscule as losing out on a job after an interview, they began to suspect that their connection to Woody had been the cause. Residents of the area began to treat Woody as the town crank, and the respect that he had spent half a century building up in small-town West Virginia was essentially gone overnight. Outside of these social ramifications, Woody began to suffer from painful headaches, but was given a clean bill of health by doctors, who found no noticeable change in his physical health. Despite that, however, the headaches and societal pressure caused him to fall into a deep depression, ultimately resulting in a divorce from his longtime wife. Eventually, Woodrow Derenberger would move away from the area, hoping to escape the story that had made him into a local legend. He first moved about 2 hours south to Midway, West Virginia, and then a few hours north to Cleveland, Ohio. But he couldn't stay away forever, and would eventually return to his home of West Virginia shortly before his death in 1990. Years earlier, though, just a handful of years after his original encounter with Cold, Woody self-published a book titled Visitors from Lanulos. This book, which was published in a very limited run in 1971, was given its title by Woodrow's conversations with the mysterious entity Cold, whom he claimed to have seen and conversed with multiple times after their original roadside chat in November of 1966. Woody claimed that Cold had visited him a handful of times in the weeks after their original encounter, and that his family had even reported seeing the peaceful individual who presented himself as a normal-looking man. In his book, Woody wrote that Lanulos was the name of Cold's home planet, and that the individual's name was not just Cold, but Indrid Cold, who hailed from the galaxy of Ganymede. You fellow space geeks, or fans of The Expanse, might recognize that Ganymede is the name of a satellite moon of Jupiter. While many of the details in Visitors from Lanulos are hard to believe, Woodrow Derenberger was not the only person in this region to describe odd happenings throughout the final months of 1966. His reported encounter with Indrid Cold on that cold November night was just the first of many mysterious sightings. In the immediate aftermath of Woodrow Derenberger's reported encounter with the individual named Cold, people throughout the area claimed to see very strange things. These were primarily sightings of weird lights in the sky, hovering or moving in an unnatural way. But on November 12th, 1966, 10 days after Woody's original encounter, things began to take an interesting turn. Clendenin is a small town about 75 miles southeast of Point Pleasant, with a population of approximately 1,500 in the mid-1960s. There, on November 12th, a group of 5 men were digging a grave. Kenneth Duncan from nearby Blue Creek, West Virginia was digging a grave for his father-in-law, Homer Smith, along with 4 others: Robert Lovejoy, William Poole, Andrew Godby, and Emil Gibson. The 4 were hard at work at the cemetery in Clendenin when they encountered what they described as a large winged creature, which emerged from a nearby patch of trees. In their later reports, the men described the creature as more of a man than a bird, which took flight and then flew over the 5 of them, coming close enough to either scare or intimidate. Duncan later described the creature, the thing in his words, as a large brown human with eyes like red reflectors. As he told reporters, it was gliding through the trees and was in sight for about a minute. Duncan and his cohorts would not report this encounter right away, only talking about it amongst themselves and with their trusted loved ones for fear of sounding crazy. But in the days to come, it became clear that others had had similar sightings with a nearly identical creature, so their fear to come forward became significantly less over time. In local folklore, this would become the first sighting of the creature known as the Mothman, but was far from the last. Newell Partridge was a building contractor who lived out on a farm in rural Doddridge County, specifically in Salem, a small West Virginia town approximately 2 hours away from Point Pleasant, and a bit further northeast than Mineral Wells. There he lived with his wife and his 3-year-old shepherd named Bandit. At around 10:30 p.m. on November 15th, Newell was watching TV with his wife when the television began emitting a strange generator noise, as described by Partridge. The sound was severe and abrasive, causing the screen to fill with static and begin displaying weird patterns and figures. At the same time, a metallic whining noise broke out outside. As reported by numerous outlets, Newell's dog Bandit started carrying on something terrible with a death howl, barking and making his way to the door. Wondering what might be occurring, Partridge grabbed a flashlight and started to go outside to check out what was interrupting his television signal and creating such a loud metallic scraping sound. Whatever it was causing Bandit to have a visceral reaction, so he knew it wasn't good. Armed with just a flashlight, Newell Partridge and Bandit stepped outside and slowly began to walk toward the barn, where the noise seemed to be emanating from. At this point, Bandit's fur was standing up on edge, and he seemed to be just as tense as Newell, if not more so. While walking, the flashlight's beam passed over a meadow nearby the home, picking up what seemed to be 2 red reflections. In a moment, Bandit bared his teeth and then ran off into the nearby woods, presumably chasing whatever had reflected the red light, while Newell Partridge ran back toward his home, away from the unknown. Newell Partridge would later report his sighting, but would never find Bandit, his dog, who ran off into the woods that night and never returned, despite having not left the property for more than 15 minutes since being adopted by Partridge and his wife. By itself, this isn't a super compelling story, but Newell Partridge's account of what he had seen seemed oddly similar to what was described by Kenneth Duncan just days earlier, in the form of red reflectors, which seemed to be this strange creature's eyes. However, what gave the region pause is that this account was incredibly similar to one reported just hours later, over 100 miles away. During World War II, a section of the woods outside of Point Pleasant became home to the West Virginia Ordnance Works. This organization was in charge of manufacturing and storing explosives for the war effort, stockpiling many of these explosives in steel bunkers known to the locals as igloos. Because of the way they were constructed, they were impossible to see from the air, built that way to fend off any potential bombing runs should the war come to that. However, in the decades after the war, some of these explosives remained, left behind in the bunkers. This area had slowly been reclaimed by nature, and to this day many of the bunkers remain untouched. For residents of Point Pleasant and the surrounding area, this has become known as the TNT area, which over time started to become known as a local lover's lane. On November 15th, 1966, 2 young couples were hanging out in the TNT area. Steve and Mary Mallett were hanging out with their friends, Roger and Linda Scarberry, joyriding out in the rural parts of West Virginia. We can only guess what these 2 couples were there for, but they were young and had reasons that young people enjoy going to places like this. I know that I, as a youngster, enjoyed checking out abandoned buildings and other creepy places. However, on this Tuesday evening, just hours after Newell Partridge had supposedly encountered the Mothman hours away, these couples would have an encounter of their own. Steve Mallett would later recall to local reporters, "We came over a little rise in the road out near the old power plant when we saw the eyes over in the bushes. They glowed red and were 6 inches apart." All 4 of the youngsters saw the 2 red eyes glowing in the bush, but brushed it off, thinking it could just be an animal. Yet the 4 continued to monitor the red lights cautiously, theorizing that the light was just hitting them in a weird way, making the sight look scarier than it actually was. Steve continued, "When we reached the paved road, there it was again, sitting on the bank across the road. This time, the 4 young adults got a better look at the thing emanating the red lights, which they described as a creature of some sort, which they stated looked like a man. According to their reports, this being stood well over 6 feet tall, with wings protruding from its back like an angel. It had a body resembling a human, absent any arms, and with a face that was hard to distinguish. The Mallets and Scarberries described it walking funny, like a penguin, but having a wingspan that exceeded 10 feet. When it went flying, it reportedly went straight up. After getting a good look at the creature, both women, Mary and Linda, started crying and they all decided to begin heading back to town to get away from whatever this thing was. Yet, that was supposedly easier said than done. They began driving through the winding wooded area of the McClintock Wildlife Station, and according to Steve Mallet, "I was doing 100 to 105 miles per hour and it was just gliding over top, sorta moving from side to side. You could hear a flapping noise. Then it came down at the car, making a squealing noise like a mouse." On their drive back to Point Pleasant, the 4 noticed what seemed to be a dead dog lying along the side of the road. But when they made their return trip back to the TNT area, they were unable to locate this carcass. In the years since, some have theorized that this might have been Newell Partridge's dog, Bandit, but that's little more than an urban legend at this point. The Scarberries and Mallets would close the handful of miles between the TNT area and Point Pleasant incredibly quickly, with the flying figure above them disappearing as they approached the town. After making it to Point Pleasant, they rushed to report their strange and scary encounter with Deputy Millard Holstead at the courthouse. Holstead knew the 4 previously, and knew that they wouldn't just make up a story like this to waste his time. He wasn't sure whether or not they had actually seen what they had claimed to, but whatever had happened had left them legitimately spooked. So he agreed to drive back with them to the TNT area to check it out. Eventually, they would return to an old brick building they had been near when they first made note of the large winged creature, which happened to be an old abandoned power plant. There, Deputy Holstead would claim that he was present when shadows circled the building, and later admitted to seeing a cloud of dust rise from an adjacent coal yard. According to reporters with UPI, he admitted that could have been the bird. When this story made the local paper in the days to come, the Mallets and Scarberries would become the temporary laughingstock of Point Pleasant, with most residents believing that the 4 had overreacted to a bird, or worse, lost their marbles entirely. But to their credit, they stuck to their story, with Mary Mallet telling reporters, "We understand people are laughing at us, but we wouldn't make up all this to make us look like fools." In the days to come, searches would be conducted in the TNT area, but no trace of the creature described by the Mallets or Scarberries would be found. However, that wouldn't stop the area from becoming a hotbed for other odd and unexplainable sightings in the months to come. Following the panicked story from the Scarberries and the Mallets, the town of Point Pleasant held a press conference to assure citizens of their safety. At this press conference, town leadership indicated that the 2 young couples hadn't seen anything unexplainable at all. Rather, they insisted that the creature they had seen was a sandhill crane, a large bird with a wingspan that could span up to 6 feet. Sandhill cranes are also known for their amber eyes, which can appear much darker in certain light. While these cranes rarely head out to the East Coast during their migrations, they do frequent many areas of North America throughout the year, so it's not unlike them to be seen near Point Pleasant. Sandhill cranes have also been used to explain the popular Jersey Devil myth, among others. However, in rebuttal, the Mallets and Scarberries would insist that the figure they had seen wasn't a sandhill crane. They described their creature as having the body shape of a man, much thicker and stockier than a sandhill crane. with bat-like wings and red eyes that were so large they distracted from making out any discernible features from the creature's head. They also stated that a sandhill crane would not be able to fly nearly as fast as their creature had, with its speed apparently exceeding 100 miles per hour at certain points. Despite their reported terror, the region had already decided to make a mockery of their sighting. The local press nicknamed this alleged creature Mothman, as if it were a villain on the popular Batman television series starring Adam West and Burt Ward. Yet, to their credit, there were some that believed the Mallets and Scarberries.
Our next guest is a Fortean, and we'll find out exactly what that is from him. He is also the editor-in-chief of Pursuit magazine. Welcome, please, John Keel. John, how are you? So you're a Fortean, eh?
Oh, well, I've been trying to outgrow it. Actually,
What is a Fortean? It's spelled F-O-R-T-E-A-N. What is that?
Back in the early part of the century, there was a man named Charles Fort who spent his entire life in the New York Public Library, going through the old scientific journals and old newspapers, and he published a series of books about strange things that turned up in these old journals, like when it would rain frogs in France, or red snow in Switzerland. He kept track of all these things, did a series of books, and we started calling these events Fortean events.
I see.
And today we still keep track of
Now, what is the most common or daily unexplained occurrence? I mean, something that we would all say, yeah, that's that thing. We can't explain it. What?
Well, we don't necessarily have daily occurrences, but in recent years, the UFO phenomenon has been very common around the world. Right now it's going on in Argentina. And while a lot of people think they have an explanation for it, actually we're just beginning to find out what's really going on with the UFO phenomenon.
UFOs are pretty much, I would guess if we asked the audience, we'd probably find over half of them said, yeah, they have reason to believe there's something going on out there, I think.
At least 10% of them have probably seen one themselves.
Has anybody here ever seen one of these things? People applaud if you've seen one. And how many of you think there may be something visiting us?
That was author John Keel being interviewed by a very young David Letterman more than a decade later. During the 1960s, John Keel was an up-and-coming writer who specialized in writing abstract, abnormal stories. An Army veteran who served in the Korean War, Keel was no stranger to facing the unknown. Throughout the decade, he would write teleplays for a number of TV shows, but would begin to focus in on the weird and peculiar, which he found himself drawn to in particular. At the time the odd happenings had started to unfold around Point Pleasant in the fall of 1966, Keel was focusing in on the burgeoning UFO phenomenon that was sweeping the nation. While he had been writing about UFO sightings being reported all over the globe, he decided to focus in on one hotspot of activity, leading him to Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Over the next year, Keel interviewed over 100 witnesses, all of whom claimed to have seen the creature nicknamed Mothman in or around Point Pleasant. Most of the descriptions remained nearly identical, with everyone describing the creature as incredibly large, with the body shape of a man and a colossal wingspan, as well as large red eyes that either entranced or intimidated, sometimes both at the same time. One of these sightings occurred just a day after the Scarberry and Mallet sighting on November 16, 1966. On that night, a bright red light had been spotted in the sky above the TNT area, close to the home of Ralph Thomas and his family. A neighbor and family friend of the Thomas family, Marcella Bennett, drove over to the Thomas home to try and find out what the cause of the glowing red light was. When she got out of her car, she went to collect her child from the back seat, but was startled by the movement of something on the ground near her. She later recalled to John Keel. It seemed as though it had been lying down. It rose up slowly from the ground, a big gray thing, bigger than a man with terrible glowing eyes. According to Marcella's account, the creature known as the Mothman began to move toward her in an unnatural way, and unable to do anything about it, she froze. According to her account, she even dropped her child for a moment, but quickly recovered, picked up her child, and ran towards the nearby home. Once inside, Marcella reportedly hid with the Thomas family, even as the Mothman paced around on the patio, peeking into windows with his large red eyes. It wasn't until the police arrived that the residents learned the creature had dispersed, leaving the entire Thomas family terrified and Marcella Bennett legitimately traumatized. Marcella Bennett would spend the next few months going through some extensive therapy sessions, apparently so traumatized that she had a hard time functioning normally in her own home, which was rather isolated on the outer edge of Point Pleasant. She was terrified of what she had seen, and this terror was only amplified by the belief that she was crazy, with very few other residents believing her story. Many in the Point Pleasant region considered her a part of a large hoax of some sort, despite her insisting repeatedly that she wasn't. Yet, the Thomas family, who had shared in her experience, albeit to a lesser extent, would continue to support and back up her claims. They combined to make just a few of the hundreds of alleged witnesses that described seeing the creature known as Mothman in the months to come. John Keel would remain in Point Pleasant for about a year, diving further into the story than he ever anticipated. He was one of the first that began to connect the multiple sightings of UFOs or lights in the sky to the mysterious Mothman creature, along with a number of animal disappearances and/or mutilations that had been reported in the surrounding area. This would become one of the focal points of his writing, which aimed to connect everything into a larger narrative. In 1967, Keel also began to popularize the term Men in Black, referring to the alleged government boogeymen that began to visit Point Pleasant. According to Keel, the arrival of these secretive government agents came when he began to notice weird occurrences, such as mailed documents changing overnight, phone lines going dead or being tapped, or even alleged witnesses feeling threatened or growing silent. Keel began to attribute these sporadic events to the Men in Black, believing that they were trying to silence the story. These Men in Black would remain a constant part of the Point Pleasant story, but would become much more relevant later on. Throughout his many months in Point Pleasant, one of John Keel's main acquaintances was a reporter named Mary Heyer. Heyer worked for the Athens Messenger, a newspaper in Athens, Ohio, located about 40 miles northeast of Point Pleasant. The Athens Messenger had a sister newspaper in Point Pleasant, and that's how Mary Heyer became involved in the reporting of the Mothman. She was just as interested in the strange sightings and witness accounts as John Keel was, but was coming at it from a much more localized, rational point of view, simply trying to uncover the cause behind what she originally viewed as mass hysteria. In the latter half of 1967, months after the Mallet and Scarberry sighting, interest in the Mothman story and the other UFO sightings began to die down, so John Keel was spending less and less time in Point Pleasant. He would return occasionally to get an interview with a handful of witnesses, but wasn't spending as much time in town as he had in the first half of the year. During one of these return trips, it was Mary Heyer who picked up John Keel from the airport. She then told him that on a night shortly before his return, she had a terrible nightmare of people drowning amongst Christmas presents. It was easy to excuse that as an odd nightmare, but John Keel made note of that for his later writings. Just a few weeks later, after returning to his home in New York, Keel began to have strange premonitions of his own. He would later claim that during this time he began to get messages from the long-forgotten Indrid Cold, delivered to him via telephone. He wrote that these messages warned him to stay away from Point Pleasant. Thankfully, John Keel wasn't in Point Pleasant during the final weeks of 1967.
For 40 years, the Silver Bridge spanned the Ohio River, linking Point Pleasant, West Virginia, with Canaga, Ohio, linking those 2 points until 5:02 yesterday afternoon.
On December 15th, 1967, tragedy struck Point Pleasant.
Mrs. Foster, what was the first thing that you saw?
Well, I heard before I saw anything. I was standing right here in my kitchen preparing dinner, and my 2 boys came out the back door down the steps to get their bicycles. They got down to the bottom of the steps here, and they started screaming. We heard this terrible boom, and my boys looked around and saw the bridge starting to fall. Well, as soon as I heard the sound, I, of course, ran out the back door to see what was wrong with the boys and what the noise was. And as I got out my back door, of course, I could see what was happening, and I stood right here and watched the whole bridge.
What did the bridge look like?
Well, it's like my little boy said. It was just like you would build a bridge out of child's building toys. And then if you just take a stick and just knock the props out from under it, that's the way it went.
Did you see all the trucks and cars falling?
I could see part of them, yes, from where I'm standing. But, of course, where the trees and things are, I couldn't see too much.
At least 57 automobiles and trucks were spilled into the icy waters of the Ohio. Eyewitnesses said the bridge seemed to shudder and then drop into the water. Some vehicles, those in the center of the span, fell 80 feet. The massive steel superstructure crashed down onto the automobiles. Passengers were trapped in the twisted wreckage.
Mr. Ellis, when was the first indication you had that everything was all wrong?
Well, I came to myself after, I imagine it was after the truck came to rest on the shore there, on the ground. Someone was trying to get me out. That's all I can remember. See, I was in the sleeper.
Were you asleep at the time the bridge fell?
Yes, sir, I was.
And what was the first thing you realized after the collapse?
I realized someone was either pulling me out of the truck cab or lifting me onto a stretcher or something. Like I was so rattled, I was trying to figure out, but I couldn't. I believe they was lifting me onto a stretcher.
What happened to the man who was driving the truck?
He's just across the room here. He has a broken back, and I'm not sure, but maybe one or two, or both of his legs broke.
The man who was in the truck with you, have you spoken to him since?
Oh, yes. He keep him under sedation because he has quite a bit of pain. But he comes to, and we talk a little bit occasionally.
Ever have an accident like this or anything like this before?
Not this serious, no. This is the worst I've seen.
Estimates were that it would take perhaps weeks to first lift the steel from the river and then extract the pinned cars. It happened so swiftly, only those who survived in the first few minutes were saved. Fred Boggs was one of them.
The bridge just went down, that's all there is to it. It all happens fast. I don't really understand what happened.
At around 5 p.m., amidst rush hour traffic, the 700-foot Silver Bridge, which crossed from Point Pleasant to Ohio over the Ohio River, collapsed. Dozens of cars collapsed into the freezing cold water below, ultimately killing 46 people. Several bodies weren't able to be recovered for days after the tragedy, and 2 were ultimately never found. Multiple others suffered injuries or trauma because of the bridge collapse, with several having been witnesses to the Mothman creature in the months prior. Constructed in 1928, the Silver Bridge had long exceeded its expected lifespan without any serious upkeep, having been used to ferry loads much heavier than originally expected. Regardless of any paranormal happenings, the Silver Bridge collapse was a serious tragedy that brought to light just how much maintenance and infrastructure funding are needed to maintain human safety. In the days and weeks that followed the collapse, news media was all over Point Pleasant yet again, buying into the myth that had been established over the past year. The narrative began to spread that the Mothman was himself responsible for the bridge collapse. Some theorized that the creature had been spotted by certain witnesses the day of the bridge collapse, while others had claimed to have seen the Mothman earlier that day, making him perhaps an omen of things to come. However, from this day forward, sightings of the Mothman seemed to come to an end in Point Pleasant. The creature wasn't spotted again en masse following the collapse of the Silver Bridge. Despite the Silver Bridge collapse marking an end to the Mothman sightings, the town of Point Pleasant wasn't entirely done with strange encounters. Mary Heyer, the reporter for the Athens Messenger that was now acting as the Point Pleasant correspondent for her paper, saw her workload increase dramatically in the weeks and months following the bridge collapse. Originally enticed by the sightings involving the Mothman, Heyer began to turn her focus onto those involving the dancing lights in the sky, which continued even after the bridge collapse. On one weekend, shortly after the tragedy, she recalled getting over 500 phone calls from residents of the area who reported seeing these bizarre lights in the sky. But on one evening in January of 1968, just a few weeks after the bridge collapse, Mary Heyer was visited by a strange man in her office. It was late at night, and Mary's office in the Point Pleasant courthouse did not receive any visitors in general. The man who stopped by her office was described as being very short with an odd, long-haired bowl cut. He also wore thick glasses and had what Mary would describe as a hypnotic gaze. This strange man terrified Mary, as he spoke in a low voice full of stutters. He did not seem to be interested at all in the bridge collapse or the Mothman sightings, but was very interested in finding out who exactly had been reporting the recent lights in the sky. During this odd conversation, the man reportedly kept inching closer and closer to Mary, who was beginning to feel very threatened. She called out for her boss just before this man turned to leave, but he paused briefly to pick up a pen from her desk. Laughing eerily to himself, he kept the pen and then ran out of the office, never to be seen by Mary again. Rumors claim that this same man visited many houses in the region, homes of those who had spotted the mysterious lights in the sky. According to these rumors, which propagate to this day, this man made almost all of the alleged witnesses very uncomfortable, with him reportedly claiming to be a reporter from Ohio. However, when questioned, he knew very little of the Ohio area, and seemed to disappear from Point Pleasant shortly after word of his presence began to spread. We can only guess at the identity of this man, or whether he ever actually existed. But it goes without saying that at this point, residents from this area of West Virginia were ready to be done with the onslaught of strange phenomena that had been terrorizing them for more than a year. Because of everything that had been reported between 1966 and 1968, Point Pleasant, West Virginia would never be the same again. The Silver Bridge tragedy had a major impact on the town, changing it overnight. Gone was the wide-eyed optimism of the 1960s UFO craze, which was replaced with a more sober retelling of the Mothman sightings. In the years to come, the Mothman would become a thing of urban legend, a dark omen of things to come. Some predict that his presence came before tragedy, with him arriving to warn residents of their impending doom. In 1971, more than 3 years after the bridge collapse, an analysis from the investigation revealed the cause. A small defect in the bridge's suspension eye bar, less than 1/10 of an inch deep, which had been the culprit of the collapse and set off the chain of events that ultimately took the lives of 46 people. This would eventually lead to an overhaul of maintenance standards for states all around the country. In 1975, John Keel brought the Mothman legend back to life with the release of his book, The Mothman Prophecies. It detailed his descent into madness as the events of 1966 and 67 unfolded, and can be seen as a book about one man's paranoid delusion as he tries to wrap his mind around something truly unexplainable. It has become the main reference source for many who believe in the Mothman or Indrid Cold myths. But even I will admit that it is hard to read without a truly open mind. Point Pleasant, West Virginia would mourn and struggle to recover from their terrible tragedy, which left dozens of residents dead. But as I mentioned a minute ago, it would never be the same again. Over the years, the city attempted to reclaim their town from the paranormal claims that had briefly taken it over, but the whispers of Mothman or strange lights in the sky would never truly leave. The town is now synonymous with the Mothman legend, and there is now an entire cottage industry inside of Point Pleasant specializing on merchandise and wares centered around the mysterious cryptid. In 2002, a generation after the Silver Bridge collapse, the town of Point Pleasant began to celebrate its annual Mothman Festival. This happened to coincide with the release of a movie titled The Mothman Prophecies, loosely based off of John Keel's book. Starring Richard Gere, the movie was a fictionalized look at events surrounding the Silver Bridge collapse, and went on to do modest work at the box office. Talk of the Mothman would never truly fade away, eventually leading to this supposed creature becoming a part of West Virginia lore. Many have claimed to have spotted a figure resembling the Mothman before other similar accidents or tragedies, including a creature known as the Chernobyl Blackbird, allegedly spotted hours before the major nuclear meltdown in Ukraine. While it's hard to determine where fact and fiction begin in the story of Point Pleasant, for that reason, the saga that began unfolding more than 50 years ago remains very much unresolved.
In the twinkling of an eye, it had happened. The great silver bridge, it did sway. From the cars and the trucks lined upon it, Lord, I wonder if they had the time to pray. A man's voice had screamed out, my God help me. From the cold icy waters there below, he was calling on God in his trouble, for he knew that his time had come to go. And wives with their children, they'd been shopping for Christmas that day. They were thinking of living, not of dying, when that great silver bridge, it gave way. Oh, my friends, do you know that we're a-traveling day by day as we journey along, and someday we must cross this chilly river, cross the bridge into our eternal home. Let's prepare now to meet all our loved ones in that land where no bridges give way and no heartaches will come to God's children, for my God shall wipe all their tears away. Sad when that silver bridge went